So now that we have our view in place, we need to actually make it so that we can post back data and, do something with it. Create that account. So to do that, let's go ahead and close our browser. We'll stop our debug. We don't need our view for the moment. Just to clarify, if we come up here, we'll see our using html.begin form. What this is going to do is it's going to generate that postback method that will post back to our create action. So I'm going to jump into the account controller, and first thing I need to do is I need to label this create action as my HTTP GET. Next, I'm going to create another action, which will be my HTTP post, and it's going to take in a create user view model. I'll call it new user. So we'll say this is an HTTP post. Now, the steps for creating this are going to involve the entity framework, because we're going to be saving that user to the database. And what we'll need to do is we will first need to validate the new user. And that validation will require checking the password versus confirm password. Actually, before we even do that, we need to check that required fields are set. And those required fields for us will be username. Well, actually, they'll be all of them. So we'll need to make sure that they're all set. We'll need to check that the password and confirm password match. And then we will need to create an instance of our DB context. And then the first step is need to make sure the username is unique, not already taken, because we don't want to create two users with the same username. Then we will create our user DTO, or data transfer object, because if you remember, when we created our DB context, we also created a class that represents our TBL users table in our database. So we need to actually populate that object with data so that we can then send it to the entity framework for it to be loaded into the database. So then after we create that user DTO, we need to add it to the DB context. And then we need to save changes. And then what I'd like to do is redirect to the login page, basically informing the user that they can now log in with that account. Okay, so let's start off with the validation steps. Now, typically to do validation for all of our fields, we would have to go through and do a pretty laborious if statement kind of collection. So we'd have to do things like if new user dot first name is not equal null, and new user dot first name dot length is greater than 0. So we have to make sure that everything is there. Well, within ASP.NET MVC, there's actually something that can check both on the client and the server side of our view model and ensure that we've got the data we need. And it basically allows us to write just one quick if statement. We can say if model state dot is valid. And that simply says if the model state is valid, then we can go on. So we'll say if it's not valid, then what we're going to do is return the view with the new user model. Oh, this actually should say action result. That's why I'm getting a error there. So this should be public action result create. All right, good thing we caught that early. All right, so what we'll do here is we'll return back to the view, passing the user view model back to the view so that it repopulates the boxes. But then basically that'll present an error saying that the required fields are missing. Now, how do we allow this magic single if statement call to work? Well, we have to go back to our user view model. And in here, we have to actually flag these as being required. So there's an attribute called required. And that comes from the system.componentmodels.data annotation namespace. So drop down on that, do the using, add it to the top, and that will allow us to mark things as required. So I'm basically going to copy this line. And here's a quick hint. You can do Control-C on a line without highlighting, and it'll actually just copy that entire line. So we'll put required here for email address. We'll put required here for gender. Username is required, password, and password confirm. Those are all required fields. The checkbox is not going to be a required field because, well, if they don't check it, that's fine. So I'm just going to put some spacing here just to make it a little easier to see. So each one of these required is then associated with the property underneath it. So we're basically saying that username is required, password is required, and ASP.NET, part of the model binding process is that it'll pick up these required attributes and it will check to make sure that there are values in those properties. And if there are not, then this model state will go invalid. So is valid will be false. And then that'll be enough of an indicator to us to say, okay, we need to go back and there needs to be an error message presented. Plus, another bonus is that within our view, if I right click here and say go to view, these validation message fors, these will actually cause the page on the user's computer to show a JavaScript error if that field is empty. And you'll see that in a little bit. So we've got that piece set up. So now we need to just check our password and password confirm. And it's really a simple statement of if new user dot password equals new user dot password confirm. And so what this currently is saying is if the new user password equals the password confirm, do this block of code. In our case, we want to say if it's not equal, so using the not symbol, then we want to do two things. We want to say model state dot add model error, and we'll put in quotes here. And then the exception will be, we'll actually just be typing an error string, and we'll say password does not match password confirm. That's the end of that statement, and then we'll return the view with new user. All right, so that's our validation. Pretty straightforward.